Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Gene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Miloš Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So, Miloš, it's been quite an eventful few weeks since our last podcast that we recorded at the end of last year. So what are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking from these few weeks?
Well, we have a lot to cover this episode, as the main story this week, at the start of this new year, has been that the United States conducted a major military operation against Venezuela, which resulted in the capture of the now former President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, with implications throughout the Americas and globally that we're going to be exploring. Then shifting to our usual hotspots, starting with the Middle East, President Donald Trump threatened to intervene militarily in Iran as the country faces large-scale anti-government protests, while Saudi Arabia conducted military strikes against UAE-backed forces in Yemen. In the Indo-Pacific, Beijing banned all dual-use exports to Japan, while President Xi Jinping met with the South Korean president, signaling increased cooperation between both countries. And then finally, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the US has backed a security guarantees proposal for a Ukraine ceasefire, and President Trump approved a bipartisan congressional sanctions package against Russia's energy sector. So as I said, no shortage of things to cover this episode.
Yeah, thanks, Miloš. So lots to cover, and we're going to start off in a bit of an unusual way, which we're going to start with the U.S. and the Americas overall, obviously with Venezuela, as you mentioned, Miloš, taking center stage here. And before we start to brief on what's been going on, across the security, political, and economic domains, I did want to note that our 2026 annual forecast had actually largely predicted the events that have been unfolding in Venezuela. And I should note that we published this on December 17th, and I just wanted to start off with a brief excerpt from that forecast, in which we wrote that the U.S. will likely extend the deployment of significant military assets off the Venezuelan coast, and Trump will likely authorize covert action to topple Maduro. There is a low likelihood that Maduro will agree to a negotiated departure from power, with a high likelihood that the U.S. will carry out attacks inside Venezuelan territory, either through covert operations or through direct military intervention. So I think that we've seen, very much the unfolding of exactly these types of events. And here I'll turn to you, Andrew, to give us an update within Venezuela and between the U.S. and Venezuela on what we've been seeing over the past week or so across those security and political domains.
Yeah, just a quick recap for listeners, because this really is an extraordinary set of circumstances, and it frames the conversation that we'll have both in this podcast, and I'm certain for many in the near future. But as listeners, I'm certain, are no doubt aware, the U.S. conducted an operation which resulted in the live capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, along with his wife. The operation was conducted, or I should specify, Maduro was physically captured by the U.S. Army's Delta Force, which is the Army Tier 1 component to the Joint Special Operations Command. Their Navy counterparts are SEAL Team 6, just for context, because that's a name of a unit that many people are probably familiar with. But essentially what we saw play out was an intense bombardment from the U.S. in coordination with a cyber campaign that targeted Venezuela's power grid, and then that resulted in the capture and then the quick removal of Maduro from Venezuela to the U.S., where he now is facing charges domestically in the United States.
Right. So all of this happened, over the course of the weekend around January 3rd and 4th. And so we're obviously in a very fast-moving situation where we've seen a lot of development since then. And so, Andrew, now that we're kind of in this period where, Maduro is now detained in the U.S., there's been obviously a very big change in the leadership of Venezuela. So what has been going on politically in the ensuing days?
Yeah, it's very interesting. now, as the dust is just beginning to settle, for now at least, to see exactly who the U.S. targeted and who it didn't. And specifically, the U.S. did not take out, and by that I mean kill or capture, any other senior leaders in the Venezuelan government. So inside Venezuela, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, was very quickly appointed as the interim leader of the country. We've been keeping our eye on a very interesting back and forth, both between her hardline stance, of course, opposed to the U.S. that she's taking publicly inside Venezuela, as well as some interesting reports about some backdoor communication that is currently taking place between Caracas and the White House right now, centering mainly on U.S. access to Venezuelan natural resources.
Yeah, and I think it's very much worth noting here that, Trump in comments since then has basically made the assertion that the U.S. would be, quote unquote, running Venezuela until a transition can take place. But it does appear that right now the Trump administration is looking to work with the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. This is very important in that, there is an opposition candidate Maria Machado, who recently had won the Nobel Peace Prize, but does not appear to be poised to take over leadership, at least according to the preferences of the Trump administration in terms of things like maintaining political continuity and elements of energy exports, which we'll get into in just a moment. So, we're very much in a wait and see situation right now on the political front, but it does appear that with the exception of Maduro, the very notable exception, that the regime does remain intact and currently being led by the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. So we'll be paying very close attention to that moving forward and updating in future podcasts. Now, I wanted to pivot very briefly, because we've got a lot to cover today, to potential implications of what we've seen transpire in Venezuela and potential future actions taken by the U.S. in the region and potentially beyond as well. So without getting into too much detail here, because I'm sure we'll cover all of these in more detail in subsequent episodes, but I think some countries to watch, particularly in Latin America, that could see some level of U.S. activity or intervention, certainly does not necessitate a military style operation that what we saw in Venezuela, but also cannot rule that out. I would say that Cuba, certainly because of its ties to Venezuela and because of its similar kind of foreign policy orientation that we saw from the Maduro regime, is very high on that list. Colombia, which was kind of in the news with Trump stating that we could see certain actions taken there. Those comments have been walked back a little bit, and kind of more looking for cooperation between the U.S. and Colombia. But we'll certainly be watching that closely. And last but not least, I would say Greenland is an area to watch very closely, as Trump has made some comments about potential action in Greenland as well. And as a result of that, we've seen both Greenland leadership as well as Denmark requesting a meeting with the U.S., in particular Secretary of State Marco Rubio, after the U.S. and after Trump refused to rule out using military force to take over Greenland, although they said that they would look to purchase it as well. So not excluding, but also not isolating the military option. And Europe certainly has been very alarmed by this and quick to react, with European allies issuing a joint statement in support of both Denmark and Greenland, while the Danish Prime Minister had stated that an American takeover of the island could result in the end of the NATO alliance. So that would be obviously very significant from an implication standpoint. We're nowhere near that at this point, but I should note that those are just a few of the key areas to watch moving forward. And I'd like to now pivot to more kind of global reactions and implications from what we've been seeing going on in Venezuela. So, Milos, why don't you just brief us both in terms of what we've seen on the energy front and perhaps some, how China has been responding to these unfolding events?
Well, obviously, as you mentioned, the situation in terms of political governance in the country is still rather fluid, but we did get an announcement following the military intervention by President Trump that he had reached an agreement with Venezuela that would see Caracas hand over a substantial number of its oil reserves, close to 30 to 50 million barrels of crude oil, which the US could then potentially sell, oil worth $3 billion into the global oil market. So, of course, the markets reacted favorably to this. Global oil prices fell by around 1% upon hearing the news. That being said, there are still a lot of questions obviously remaining. Oil executives have been briefed by the Trump administration and they have met with the president. However, they have warned publicly that they do still require, and I'm quoting, serious guarantees from the United States before committing to investing in Venezuela. And this is despite assurances by Trump that they would be reimbursed by the US, just because even in the most favorable times, the investment into the country and into the industry is a risky one. Turning to China, and China is an interesting one just because of how big of an ally it was to Venezuela. We've gotten quite a lot of reactions from Beijing, mainly, really harshly condemning the action by the United States. On the economic front, China in the past has loaned more than $100 billion to Venezuela since the early 2000s. Nearly 40% of all the loans that China gave to the region went to Venezuela. So it was quite strong economic partner, also by virtue of China being the biggest buyer of Venezuelan oil. But this also marked quite a strong strategic potential recalculation for China. And there's been a lot of chatter over the past week on whether this action by the US would give China leeway in its actions against Taiwan. Now, I should say that, we can cover this later on or as the episodes come along. The calculus in invading Taiwan or making any action against Taiwan remains the same for China. It is still a very risky operation, no matter to what extent it is taken. So it is unlikely that China is going to make a move anytime soon on Taiwan. In fact, they're probably going to be taking the time now to look at what could have been improved on the Venezuelan front, as we know that the Venezuelan armed forces use a lot of equipment, including radar and intelligence systems that were procured by China. What we may see is possibly some, renewed discussions with the US, particularly on, potentially buying the Venezuelan oil from the US, even though that may not be something that China publicly wants to do, as well as potentially China gaining concessions from the United States in terms of international law enforcement in the South China Sea. So lots of things in the air, but safe to say that the leadership in Beijing is not very pleased, as you can imagine, with the situation.
Right. So, yeah, lots of reactions and ripple effects that have only begun to occur from this U.S. intervention in Venezuela. So we'll certainly be circling back on this topic and all of its related developments in future episodes. But for now, we'll have to leave it there and now pivot to our next global hotspot, which is the Middle East. So, Andrew, I'll turn back to you here. Overshadowed, but certainly very important alongside, the Venezuela developments is ongoing protests that actually started at the end of last year, at the end of 2025 in Iran. So what can you update us on what we've seen within Iran and some of the reactions to those protests?
Yeah, very significant news. And again, this is the kind of thing that during another week might be the dominant story that we're talking about. But as you noted, Eugene, there's a mass protest movement currently occurring inside Iran. It is currently a nationwide protest sparked by, I'm certain, a number of contributing factors, but primarily the dire economic conditions that Iranians are facing inside the country. As of today, and these numbers likely are already out of date, but just going with the latest that we have, at least 32 people have been killed so far during the protests, and at least 2,200 have been detained by the Iranian government. Now, there's a lot of talk of whether this protest movement represents an existential threat. And of course, the movement and the economic conditions behind it represent an existential threat to the survival of the Iranian regime. Iran typically responds domestically to these things as if they do. And we are seeing that here, but it's fair to wonder if we are seeing at least a measure of restraint, again, just compared to what we would typically expect from the Iranian government domestically because of threats from U.S. President Donald Trump, who has said that he is willing to intervene militarily against the Iranian government if they continue to quote the president, continue to kill peaceful and innocent protesters. Of course, the Iranian government themselves have reacted, at least rhetorically, very strongly to these threats from President Trump. But on the ground, and again, I think that the recent Maduro op from the United States and Venezuela is a significant contributing factor to this. I do think that this is having some level of restraining impact on the Iranian government.
Yeah, definitely. I think Iran is a country that's watching very closely, what happened between the U.S. and Venezuela and potential implications for what's going on inside of the country, obviously going back to last year when the U.S. intervened along with Israel against Iran's nuclear program and various military sites. So this is a country we'll have to be watching very closely, both in terms of the domestic protest situation as well as any further U.S. activities in support of that. But moving on to another region within the Middle East where we've seen a lot of notable security activity. And here I'm talking about Yemen, as well as the very significant involvement of two Gulf countries within the country, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So Andrew, what can you update us in terms of what's been going on in Yemen and what the role is of Saudi and UAE in that?
Yeah, so over the course of the last year and really before that, we've talked quite a bit about Yemen. However, that's almost always done, at least here, in the context of external events, specifically Houthi attacks against international shipping and exchanges of fire of varying intensity between the Houthis and Israel. But very significant news from inside Yemen this week. And of course, as you mentioned, Eugene, with a significant foreign intervention as well. So very quick context just for listeners. At the highest level, essentially what we're seeing is at least renewed attention on a rupture between anti-Houthi Yemeni forces, basically a split between Saudi-backed forces and forces backed by the UAE, primarily the Southern Transition Council or the STC. As the name suggests, they have their own objectives, which involves the breakaway. It's an independence movement of Southern Territory in Yemen, and of course that has its own history inside that country. But focusing specifically on events of this week, we saw a major surge of activity on the ground, a ground campaign from the SAT in which they captured a significant amount of territory from those Saudi-backed forces, which I will note is the internationally recognized government of Yemen, although they are essentially entirely dependent on Saudi Arabia. The Saudi reaction was swift and decisive. They essentially conducted a very intense air campaign against STC positions, very notably as well against a large weapons shipment that the UAE was bringing in to assist the Southern Transition Council forces. And then basically what played out in a very intense way on the ground, but over the course of a week, was the Saudi Air Force and its Yemeni partners on the ground achieving their objectives, and the UAE announcing that they are going to end their military mission and presence inside of Yemen, which was one of the demands from the Saudis in reaction to the offensive of this past week.
Understood. So lots going on there in the Yemen theater. I should note that Saudi Arabia did allege today, which is Thursday, January 8th, that the UAE had actually smuggled that SDC leader in Yemen that's wanted for treason out of the country and flew him to Abu Dhabi. So that's, continuing a source of tension between Saudi and the UAE, seemingly not on that. So lots to pay attention to there moving forward. And just very briefly, I know there's so much to cover here, but if you could just have a quick update on the Israel-Gaza theater and any related theaters to round out the Middle East.
Right. Quite a bit that we could talk about, but just to give listeners at least a picture of the region as possible in terms of current events of the past week. Numerous security violations occurred in Gaza, where the IDF killed at least 5 Palestinians in a series of shootings and bombings, in the Khan Yunis area of the territory. The IDF also carried out numerous airstrikes in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah positions. Some interesting diplomatic updates from Lebanon as well that I'm sure we'll be able to talk about in the near future. And then just very briefly in Syria, there was an intense surge of violence between the Syrian army, government forces, and the Kurdish-led Syrian self-defense forces in the city of Aleppo. This is still ongoing. At least 12 people so far have been killed and thousands have been displaced. This latest round of fighting between the Syrian army and the SDF occurred when integration talks between those two entities once again stalled.
Gotcha. So a number of different fronts of military escalation that we're seeing within the Middle East. And I should note, similar to what we had described with the U.S. and Americas, with some hybrid dimensions thrown in there. So very much we'll be keeping track of that. And now let's pivot to another hotspot, which is the Indo-Pacific, where I'll turn back to Milos to give us updates on some hybrid dimensions that we've seen really escalate between China and Japan over Taiwan. So what can you update us there, Milos?
Yes, so relations between China and Japan have kind of taken the forefront over the past couple of months due to, as listeners will recall, comments made by the Japanese Prime Minister regarding a potential attack on Taiwan being an existential threat to Japan itself. So China obviously didn't take too kindly to that over the past couple of months and has enacted a series of escalating market restrictions or sanctions packages. Now, the latest one on that is that the Ministry of Commerce in Beijing banned the export of dual-use goods to Japan. So these are, items and technologies that can be used, whether in the civilian sphere or even in the military sphere. And China has an export control list of around 1,000 or so of these items and technologies that require a license to be shipped overseas. So this caused quite a bit of panic, notably in the automotive industry, as obviously a lot of these technologies, including rare earths and certain magnets and the like, are used in the construction of cars. However, China has since come out and assured that the only targets of these restrictions are end users that are in the military domain. So in theory, the automotive industry isn't affected by these restrictions. And it is interesting to see that China did sort of leave itself some wriggle room here, looking like it doesn't completely want to deteriorate relations with Japan completely, but is certainly putting the pressure on Taiwan, on the whole situation there. Regarding Taiwan itself, I just wanted to bring attention to something that we weren't able to cover in the past couple of weeks. But at the end of December, China did conduct live-fire military drills around Taiwan, dubbed Justice Mission 2025, and these were the largest drills since 2022 and involved pretty much all of China's military branches, including the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, and the Rocket Force. And these drills simulated a comprehensive blockade of Taiwan's main ports. And this came after a couple of months of seemingly not really any military action around Taiwan, but this came just after the US announced quite a large weapons sale to the island. And this week, Taiwan's National Security Bureau actually released a report that stated that during these drills, China supplemented the military component with over 4 million cyber attacks and disinformation posts against the island. So clearly, having said all that at the beginning of the episode about not acting on Taiwan, China is keen to keep the pressure up, not only against Taiwan itself, but also against its allies, whether actual potential, as is the case with Japan. And it looks like with Tokyo that these escalations are likely to continue in the coming months.
Understood. And speaking of escalation, there's been quite a lot of activity out of North Korea and on the Korean Peninsula in general. So what can you update us on that front?
Yeah, so from North Korea, we got the news from South Korean security services actually earlier this week that North Korea had launched several ballistic missiles off of its east coast in its most recent tests that it usually conducts. This is actually the first test of the year, and we can assume that there's going to be many more to come. And recently, in the past couple of weeks, actually, we've seen a few of these tests, even going into the end of 2025, that included long-range as well as short-range cruise missiles, anti-air missiles, as well as certain images that surfaced suggesting that North Korea was making a progress on the construction of a nuclear-powered submarine, which is obviously quite an advanced capability that the US had been keen to avoid North Korea getting its hands on. And state media from North Korea has actually reported that this was likely to continue, that the leader, Kim Jong-un, had actually visited a facility that's involved in the making of these weapons and actually ordered an expansion of the current production by at least double over the course of the year. And we know that there has been a lot of public efforts and statements made by not only the United States but also South Korea regarding the potential outreach to the North in order to engage in talks on denuclearization. So all quite possible that this is North Korea trying to basically assert itself and maximize its negotiating cards when and if those negotiations come to the table this year. And I should note just that this also comes on the heels of the commander of the United States forces in Korea saying that the scope of his forces have now widened to not only include a military response on the Korean peninsula, but also to potentially be primed to respond to a Taiwan contingency. So not that the two are linked necessarily, but we're seeing that the Korean peninsula is going to likely be a major contributor to our weekly updates going forward.
Right. And as we've seen these military developments, around North Korea, some notable diplomatic developments related to South Korea and China. So what can you briefly update us there?
Yes, indeed. So it should be noted that these tests from the North actually coincided exactly with the visit from the South Korean President Lee Jae-myung to China, which was the first such a visit of his tenure. And it actually follows the reverse. So when President Xi visited South Korea back in late October. So we're seeing that there is a warming of relations between both countries, which, as a reminder, had been quite tense for the past couple of years after the sale of advanced weapon systems by the US to the South. These were mainly discussions that were held over economic ties. We saw that there were a number of cooperation deals signed between companies of both countries. And there was also a pledging of enhanced cultural exchanges. The biggest development was that both sides seemed to signal, a joint effort to cooperate on reaching out to North Korea, as I mentioned, in order to, at the very least, stabilize the peninsula, if not to even prime it for negotiations in the future. Should be mentioned that there was no other mention of any of the other, grievances or points of friction between both countries, and that includes Taiwan or activity in the East China Sea. But it is a notable development, and I'm sure that we will continue to see, as I mentioned, South Korea coming in the news, in particular with regards to relations with China.
Understood. And let's round out the podcast with the final global hotspot of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So, obviously kind of in the context of everything that's been going on in the Americas and throughout the world, we don't want to lose sight of some very important updates, especially on the diplomatic front with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So, Andrew, what can you update us in terms of what we've been seeing there over the last week?
Yeah, so to make a long story short, the big news this week on the diplomatic front is that the U.S. has come out and publicly backed security guarantees, proposed security guarantees, I should say, that the U.S., Ukraine, and your typical European allies proposed during a summit in Paris between January 6th and January 7th. Specifically, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, participated in the summit typically, or at least the recent past. They would not participate in these sorts of gatherings in Europe. They did this time, however, which is notable. And Also notable is their public support for this proposed deal. Both Kushner and Witkoff are advocating for it very strongly. On that note, Volodymyr Zelensky himself has said that the deal is nearly ready, or I saw another quote, 90% ready. Now that other 10%, as Zelensky sees it, of course, is centered over remaining questions on territorial control in Ukraine, specifically over the territory of the Donbass and Zaporizhia. This is significant, not necessarily because Russia is anywhere closer to negotiating in good faith. That's a separate topic, but because I think that this is the closest we have seen the allies, so to speak, present a united diplomatic front at this point in the negotiation process.
Understood. And as we're seeing these negotiations unfold, and as you said, kind of seemingly nearing closer to the finish line, at least to some sort of ceasefire agreement, there have been continuation of military and hybrid, updates, and in some cases escalations. So, what can you update us there?
Yeah, on the military front, of course, as always, even when we're not able to talk about it, there's very significant and intense fighting going on at the ground at all times. The Russians are claiming the recent capture, of a village in Ukraine's Sumy region. I have not seen any denials from the Ukrainian government on if that is actually the case or not. There's often a rapid exchange of territory in those parts of the country. We will keep our eye on that. Turning now to the hybrid update, some very significant events over this past week. Most notably, the United States seized a Russian-flagged vessel that had been evading the current U.S. blockade in place around Venezuela. The vessel was heading back, presumably towards Russia, when it was seized in the North Atlantic. The vessel was boarded by U.S. Navy SEALs, which is not a surprise. This type of operation is their bread and butter. There was no resistance offered by the crew. I should also note that following the Maduro op, this particular vessel received a Russian naval escort, at least one submarine, potentially other assets. So a meaningful, but I think very measured and careful response from the Russians, at least in terms of action on the ground or at sea. The Russians currently, of course, are demanding the immediate release of the crew and their return to Russia. No updates on that right now, but the question that remains is this the type of thing that we are likely to see more of from the United States? And then looking domestically inside the U.S. right now, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham has said that Trump has, quote, greenlit proposed bipartisan legislation that would target a new round of sanctions against Russia's energy sector. Specifically, this would entail secondary sanctions against major importers of Russian energy. So we're talking India, Brazil, and China. That's quite significant. This might sound familiar just because we have been talking about this legislation on and off for some time. But again, given recent events in Venezuela, somewhere we usually don't talk about in relation to these other things, there is, I think, a reasonable case to make that we might see increased hybrid action on that front in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be very important to watch, Russia's reaction to this, kind of how we started off with Venezuela and going into the not only regional but global implications and ripple effects. Milos touched on China's reaction, and I think this, particularly that boarding of the Russian flagged oil vessel by the U.S. is very notable and will be important to watch Moscow's reaction to that moving forward. But that's about all that we have time for this week. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.